Welcome back again to the Ivory Tower Collections. Today's video is going to be a pretty simple one. I'm going to go through the process of replacing the capacitors in this old Roland MT-32 sound module. Now these modules originally came about, I believe, around 1987, and there's two primary versions of this module. You've got what they call the old style and the new style. The differences between them externally are very minimal. Internally, quite a bit actually. For starters, I'll just kind of briefly go through. The old style here looks just like this one here. This is what I primarily use. And the main difference between the old style and the new style as far as physically is the addition of an extra headphone jack on the back. That's it really, as far as external differences go. Internally, there's quite a few differences, but they mainly have to do with quality of the audio that comes out of it. But again, the purpose of this video is going to be the replacement of all of the capacitors inside of this MT-32. Now you might be asking yourself, what is this thing about and why do we care? Well, the MT-32 was again released around 1987. It was basically a prosumer level device in that Roland released it as an answer to provide a fairly inexpensive method for budding musicians to have their own synthesizer sound module. And the Roland MT-32 is sought after today for those that like to play older games, mostly from the DOS era. That was over 30 years ago. And like a lot of things, the electrolytic caps inside the MT-32 can dry out and go bad. Now, I've not heard of any MT-32s specifically having leakage issues or anything like that, but again, as a good preventative measure, it doesn't hurt to go ahead and replace the capacitors from time to time in all of your electronics, especially once they hit the 20+ years in life. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to go through the process of replacing the capacitors. So let's get to it. The first thing we need to discuss is what kind of tools are we going to need? Well, you're going to need a number 2 Phillips to get inside the case. You're going to need a set of flush cutters, always good to have. Side cutters, wire cutters, whatever you want to call them. I call them flush cutters because you basically cut them flush with the PCB. I like to have my trusty little Sharpie so I can make marks on the board, PCB board. Specifically, I like to mark where the negative terminals go through on the bottom side, and it also acts as a good indicator of the fact that I have already replaced that capacitor. I might also need my via reaming tool. Hopefully not too much, but occasionally I'll have some troublesome solder that gets stuck inside the vias, and this little guy right here is good at getting it punched out. Also need my little tweezers. They always come in handy. I use these all the time now for all kinds of things. They're good for holding onto capacitors as you're trying to solder them in or get them placed in right, and especially useful for removing them out once you've desoldered them. Also handy to have a toothbrush, an old toothbrush around. This is to clean up afterwards. Again, we're going to have a lot of potentially some flux and residue left on the board. We'd like to get rid of it from time to time. Another set of needle nose pliers. Yes, I have the tweezers, but sometimes you might need something with a little more oomph. And so I like to have a couple of different varieties of different size needle nose pliers. So in addition to these items, you're also going to need a capacitor kit. And recently, with my assistance, Console 5 now offers replacement capacitor kits for the Roland MT-32 Revision 1 unit, which is what we're going to use today. Aside from this, we might also need, or I wouldn't say might, but it's preferable. I'm also going to have my flux, my solder flux available. Obviously, we're going to need a good soldering iron. And I'm also going to be using my trusty Hakko FR300 desoldering iron. And of course some solder as well. So with that, let's break down the MT-32 and get started. The MT-32 is a very easy box to actually get into. Again, this was designed for prosumer level, basically meaning that it's not quite commercial grade and it's a little bit higher quality than normal consumer grade. But in any event, it's actually very easy to get into it. But a couple things to be aware of. So the main way that you get into one of these is there are 4 Phillips screws right here on the edges next to the rubber feet if yours still has the feet. Now you're also going to see some other Phillips screws along the bottom. Do not remove those. Those screws are actually part of the standoffs the brass standoffs inside the case that hold the main PCB inside the system. So if you start loosening these up, then the PCB assembly itself is going to flop around inside. You don't want that. So again, you only need to loosen these 4 screws here. The screws originally feature a little star washer that goes with them, so make sure you keep that as well. You don't want to lose that. Additionally, the case on these just slips over the bottom assembly. It's basically 2 halves, the case is. So as a result, once you start to loosen these, you're going to see it start to sink down a little bit. Don't get alarmed. There's just some extra gap there and some play between the metal that allows it to do that. Okay, I now have my screws removed. I'm going to carefully, while holding this in my hand, you can already see that maybe part of the lid is trying to come loose on me here. And I'm going to set it sideways for a second, and I'm just going to slide this cover right off. There we go. And then I'm going to set this off to the side. And here are the guts inside of the MT-32. It looks pretty complicated, and I suppose it was for 1987. But to be honest, it's really not that complex at all. You've got a standard voltage regulator over here. It's a 7805 that regulates and provides 5 volts to the rest of the system. And there are quite a few capacitors, as you can see, but there's only like about 23 of them on this model. That's not too bad. And they're fairly easy to get to, provided you take the various connectors out and get to it. It actually uses an Intel processor to drive the brains of an MT-32. So yeah, at the time it was a very advanced piece of electronics, especially for the home user. And a lot of video games, a lot of computer video games, especially adventure games, really took advantage of the sound capabilities of the MT-32. Let's break it down a little bit further. Now here's what we need to do. Obviously we have some cables that have to come off of here. We've got some standard Phillips screws on this side of the board that we need to remove that will allow us to remove the PCB. Now one other thing to note here is that the voltage regulator, which again you might be able to see right here, is actually bolted to the side of the frame here, and it just uses this little Molex connector, this little 3-pin cable connector, to pull off and get that loose. The reason why you need to separate that is because this cable is actually soldered down onto the main PCB. Also, make note that when you remove this, that the red wire points up. Makes it easier whenever you're putting the cable back on, if you remember that. Okay, now I'm going to remove the rest of the cabling. The rest of it pretty much just has to kind of pull off of here a little bit. It can be kind of tricky. Again, these are kind of older connectors. You do want to be careful with them because they are old and made of plastic. They could also be quite brittle. So you don't want to go all gung-ho on them, as it were. You might damage them. Let's see, we've got a additional cable here. And another little guy right here. There we are. And then we've got these 2 cables here. Now these 2 cables here actually control the interface for the LCD driver, because it does have an LCD panel on it to tell you what instruments are playing and other functions of the module. And also the other cable manages the front panel input. Now these cables come off a little bit differently than some, and it took me a little bit to figure it out. It's just an older cable connection type, no big deal. What you do is you actually push down on the cable on the back side, and then you can just lift the ribbon cable right up, and you can see, I'm not sure how well that'll show up on the camera, but basically they're just 10 little fingers that come off of there. So you don't want to yank it out. You got to push down on the back side where it's thickest on the back of the connector, and then these cables just lift right out. Okay, so at this point what we need to do to get the rest of the PCB out of here is we've got to get rid of some screws holding the PCB in place, and also there are 2 more screws right here next to the MIDI input ports. And those screws are holding the actual MIDI input connections down to the case, but then in addition, those connectors, of course, are soldered down onto the main PCB. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these. And then I'll proceed to remove the rest of the screws from the case. It's really nice. Roland actually thought about serviceability in mind. There's actually notches cut out on the back of the bottom case here to allow a screwdriver down in straight down to be able to get to the screws. Now these screws are a little bit smaller than all the other screws, so they're not quite the same, and they also have little star washers on them, just like the other ones did. There we go. And now the main PCB assembly will lift right out. We don't need the bottom portion of the shell or the case anymore, so we can set that off to the side. Turn this back around. And here we are. Now we can proceed to start to replace all the capacitors. Now, like a lot of other projects I've worked on, you kind of want to have a system when you do this, and that would be to basically get the capacitors out, and you want to kind of lay them out in some sort of a fashion or a method that makes sense to you. Basically, I tend to start with like the lowest value capacitor, and I set it off around the edges so that I know exactly which ones, where they're located when I need to grab them. Now, the one capacitors that might give you trouble if you're not purchasing a kit and you're purchasing these by themselves are the 1000 microfarad capacitors, of which there's quite a few of them used for filtering on the main board here. They're about an inch or so tall, at least, I'd say, just a hair over. So you want to make sure that, you know, replacements that you get are the same size or potentially even smaller. I believe the replacements I have are almost the exact same size. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through my capacitors here, make sure I've got all of the ones I need, and I'm going to lay them out in a method that makes sense and zoom in the camera and we'll get to work. So I've got my capacitors laid out in front of me here, and I've also made sure to have a capacitor map handy as well. So again, Console 5 always provides capacitor maps for everything. It's very handy for whenever you need to go through and track everything that you're doing. So normally whenever I'm replacing the capacitors on a component like this, I want to have some sort of a pattern that I follow. Usually I'll start from like one corner of the board and sort of work myself in a circle around. And that's probably what I'm going to do in this case. I think what I'll probably do is I'll start with this side over here. It's a little less populated, just to get an idea as to how the board and the components are going to respond to my iron. It gives me a chance to adjust any other temperature, things like that. Shouldn't be too big a deal. So that's what we'll do. We'll get started over here. And the interesting thing about this is I'm actually going to be starting basically from the bottom, or the last capacitor, up to the first capacitors in the system. So here I go. Okay, so I finally have the capacitors replaced out on this side of the board here for right now. Now you might have noticed in looking at the video that it looked like I was having some trouble with some of these, and that is because a lot of these, and to be honest, I'll probably encounter this more, if you take a good look at the layout of the traces on this PCB on the back, you'll see that we have very large ground planes in place, and as such they're really absorbing the heat from the iron. So what I'm having to do is just apply more solder on top of that and keep trying until I get all the solder removed to get them fully out of there. So yeah, just kind of tricky, just one of those things you got to look out for, and it's a pretty common deal. I'm also having to adjust the temperature between the iron between different points, because obviously I don't want the iron super hot if I'm soldering onto something that has a small trace, because that might damage the trace or lift the pad off the PCB while I'm doing the work, and that would not be good, of course. So what I'm going to do here is I've got some pins to trim off real quick. I can see right here, and then I'm going to get my toothbrush out and some alcohol, some IPA, and I'm going to go over the board real quick where I just replaced out these capacitors just to clean up the work that I've done so far. Now this will likely remove the Sharpie marks that I've made, but since I already know that I've worked on this side of the board and I already have these replaced out, I already have the polarity of the capacitors as well as which ones I've done. I already have that known. So it's not that big a deal if I remove my Sharpie markings on the bottoms of the board here. Okay, that helps that quite a bit. Get it nice and clean. And then I will start on the largest parts of the capacitor replacement, which is going to be in this area here. So again, I've done these here. Now it's time to take out this section here. So here we go. Okay, I've now completed the capacitor replacement in this section, and I'm going to go ahead and get my alcohol again and clean it up on the bottom side. Now there's only a few more capacitors left to replace, and that is these four up here, which I believe are all the same type, and I believe these are the non-polar or the bipolar capacitors. Either way, non-polar, bipolar, it just means there's no real polarity to them. And I've got those all ready to go right here. They're all the same value. And then I have two more left down here. I'm gonna go ahead and get these four bipolar ones changed out right now. Okay, we're just down to these last two capacitors. I'm going to go ahead and change them out, and then I'm going to clean out this side of the board. Now, something interesting I want to show you before I put this last capacitor in, because I noticed this on pretty much every capacitor, and this is kind of unusual. A lot of boards will have a dot or something to indicate where the polarity is on the boards. Sometimes they don't, and that's why it's important to pay attention when you're removing a capacitor to notate how the polarity is laid out. On these Roland boards, the larger capacitors actually did have a dot or a little box indicating which side was the negative lead. But most of the smaller ones did not. However, what they did have was this. And I'm going to show you this. Hopefully my camera will be able to zoom in on this. There we go. So this is the last capacitor to put in. You can see the holes you can see my mat through the holes there. All of the negative leads on the bottom side of the board actually have a square pad marked on them. And that's cool. Usually that indicates a ground. On IC chips, you'll see a pad that's square, or yeah, square versus circular. And that's usually marking ground. Well, in this particular case, on all the capacitors on this particular board, that square pad indicated where my negative lead needed to go. So very cool. And again, it's not something I usually see on something like this. So kind of a pleasant surprise. So I'm going to go ahead and get this last cap put in, and I'll be able to button this thing up and call it done. And there we are. All the capacitors are replaced. No big deal. So again, a couple things to keep in mind on this is that it is it's not a single layer board. It is at least 2 layers. So I noticed when I was working on it that there were traces on both the top and bottom that met up with some of these capacitors. So make sure that when you replace them out that you have good connectivity to the leads on these capacitors from both the top and the bottom wherever they need to go. If you're not sure, an easy way to check is to take a look and just see if you have continuity from the bottom side of the board to the next nearest component on the top side of the board. That way you know that the capacitor leg is making that connection go through and everything is where it needs to be. So I'm going to put this thing back in and probably give it a test, fire it up, make sure it's still working and good to go. And that'll conclude this video. So again, thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll catch you next time.